So, now let's begin with today's event with a brief learning on the principle of humanity. The initial presentation forms part of PHAP's online learning series on humanitarian law and policy. For those of you who are PHAP members and are listening online, this is part of the Continuous Learning Credits program. Please watch and listen for the numerical code, which I will mention at the end. You'll need that code to access the assessment and earn your credit for the session. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce our guest expert for this presentation, Dr. Hugo Slim. Hugo is the head of policy at the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, based in Geneva. Hugo started his career as a frontline humanitarian worker for Save the Children and later worked as a senior research fellow at Oxford. Hugo's books include Humanitarian Ethics, A Guide to the Morality of Aid in War and Disaster, and Killing Civilians, which he assures me is not a guidebook, but actually an analysis of the method, madness, and morality in war. He's eminently well placed to lead this session, and we're very glad to have him here today. Over to you, Hugo.
Thank you very much, and thank you for such a generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to speak to PHAP members today, and I think PHAP is an excellent project, and I'm really delighted to be speaking to members for the first time all around the world. It's also my first time speaking to a group of humanitarians as a member of the ICRC, so that's a first for me, a personal first. And I'm really glad we've got such an experienced panel to follow me and probably correct me if I need it. I want to start by a little story. I had a wonderful week earlier this year teaching human rights for a whole week in a high school in Los Angeles in California in the USA. And I had the most incredible experience of teaching classes of kindergarten, children age of sort of 4, and right up through the early teens to last year people of about 18 years old. And in the first session, the opening session, when I spoke to the whole school at once, I gave a little presentation on human rights, and then we took questions, and there were a lot of good and impressive questions from the teenagers. And I saw a little girl sitting on the floor who must have been about 6, and she was really keen to ask a question. So I said, please, what's your question? Ask your question. And she said, great confidence, Hugo, what's your favorite human right? And it was a stunning question, because of course there are quite a lot of human rights, and I had to choose. And it was a brilliant question, cut straight to the truth of things. And of course, after a moment of reflection, I chose the right to life. And luckily, she seemed quite happy with that. And I suppose today I'm talking about humanitarian principles. And at the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, we have 7 fundamental principles. And I've been asked to talk about the first one. And I'm particularly happy to be talking about the first one because actually it's my favorite humanitarian principle. And the reason for this, the reason it's my favorite humanitarian principle, is that it is the most fundamental of the fundamental principles. It's also the most beautiful of the fundamental principles. And it's also the most intuitive and instinctive of the fundamental principles. We know what humanity is. It is close to our hearts. We do not have to work too hard to work it out and calculate it in practice as we do with impartiality, neutrality, and independence. So thank you to Mark and PHAP and others for giving me my favorite principle to talk about, and I'll try and do it justice. And if I fail to do it justice, it's not a problem, because you know what humanity is already, because you are human, because you have felt humanity in your life, because you have needed humanity at times in your life, and because you have been humane and humanitarian to others. So even if I fail in the next 20 minutes, you know what the principle of humanity is anyway. But I will try and do 4 things now. I'll try first to describe the values and the virtue of humanity. I will then try and describe how humanity is elaborated in law and practices. In other words, how it's made concrete on the ground. And thirdly, I'll identify a couple of operational problems and dilemmas with humanity. And finally, I'll just discuss questions of ownership and the universality of humanity as a principle. So to start with humanity, let's talk about the value that we mean by humanity. And quite clearly, humanity is the goal of humanitarian action. And just to revisit the Red Cross definition that you've got in front of you, humanity is to prevent and alleviate human suffering wherever it may be found. Its purpose is to protect life and health and to ensure respect for the human being. So in that definition, we see an obligation to prevent and alleviate human suffering. We also see a commitment to life and health, and we also see a commitment to respect for the human being. The respect for the human being that is often called the dignity of the human being in human rights talk. So in the Red Cross ICRC fundamental principle definition, humanity is framed as an objective. It is a goal. In fact, it is our purpose in everything we do in humanitarian action. And for us, ICRC, it is our single purpose. We have no other purpose than to help build and create humanity in armed conflict and other situations of violence. So the Red Cross and Red Crescent definition is one of intention and objective and activity. It describes a virtuous, good action to relieve suffering, to ensure the respect for the human being. But we must go deeper than that, because why is that an important thing to do? Why do we want to protect life and health and respect the human being? Why do we have this humanitarian intention? And behind this objective, behind the objective of the principle of humanity, is a deep value. And this value is human life and the human person. Humanity says two things. Deep down, it speaks of value, that human life and the human person is a fundamentally good thing. We are each precious, and we are all precious. Humanity, therefore, as flesh, blood, and personal dignity, is a fundamental good we must protect as much as possible. And the second thing that humanity says is that humanity is also a virtue. It is a way to ensure this good thing is protected. So knowing life and dignity are valuable requires us, morally, and as I'll show legally, to be humanitarian, to be humane. So, in other words, there is a value deep down in humanity, which is the value of human life and respect for the human person. And that creates an operational virtue where it is the right thing to protect and respect the human being. So there is the conviction of humanity, or the philosophy of humanity. But now to my second point. How is humanity then realized and made concrete in the world, in our actions, in our agencies? And the answer to this is that humanity is carefully elaborated in law and practice in three key ways. For those of the ICRC and those of you who are familiar with international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions and refugee and human rights law, it's obvious that humanity, the principle of humanity, the value placed on human life and respect for the human being, is the inspiration and driving idea behind international humanitarian law, behind refugee law, and behind human rights law. The principle that we speak of in the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols of humane treatment is the way that humanity is made concrete in law and practice, prioritizing humane treatment. So how does this humane treatment, this making concrete humanity, how does it happen? And it happens in various ways. The first way is that in law, there are certain legal identities given to people which give them a humanitarian identity. So in international humanitarian law, we have non-combatants, we have civilians, we have those who are hors de combat, who are identified as protected persons, to be treated with humanity. And in refugee law, we have refugees as a humane category in international law, and refugees are to be treated humanely with humanity. And the same is extended into the guiding principles on IDPs. And in human rights law, we have the principle that everyone at all times is to be treated with humanity and humane treatment. So humanity is very much made concrete and elaborated in specific laws and legal categories of person to be protected. But the second way it is made concrete in law is in law referring to the conduct of armed conflict. So, in the Geneva Conventions, conduct must be determined by humanity. The conduct of war must be as humane as possible. And we therefore get humane principles in the Geneva Conventions, such as distinction, precaution, proportion, humane treatment, and protection. So humanity requires military forces to distinguish between civilians and combatants. It requires military forces to take precaution, so it does not hurt people and treat them inhumanely unnecessary. The same with proportion, the same with humane treatment for people in detention or in any other situation, and the overriding commitment to protection of the person. These are the principles of international humanitarian law, which are built from humanity. And then thirdly, of course, humanity is made concrete in legally elaborated and required humanitarian activities. And I suppose the three big ones are humanitarian assistance, humanitarian protection, and humanitarian advocacy, which we at the ICRC would call humanitarian diplomacy. So those three activities, assistance, protection, and advocacy, are concrete manifestations of the principle of humanity, giving people food, helping them with their livelihood, helping people with health, water, sanitation, protecting people, whether in detention in our case or many other situations where people are threatened with violence. These are all humanity in action. This is the concrete steps taken to deliver the principle of humanity in armed conflict. So moving on to the third point, what are some of the operational consequences and dilemmas or problems of trying to operate with humanity in armed conflict? The first operational problem is, of course, that not everybody is trying to operate with humanity in armed conflict. So for a humanitarian agency and for all of you working in different parts of the world, you are often working in the context of major and deliberate failures of humanity, failing in humanity to one another, deliberate inhumane conduct of armed conflict and hostilities, the direct targeting of civilians, rape, sexual violence, summary executions, inhuman detention treatment, starvation, displacement. You are often operating amidst huge and frequently deliberate failures of humanity. So that's the first big challenge to the principle. The second big challenge to the principle of humanity in action is not always deliberate, but it's the restriction of humanitarian action, what we might call blocking problems, where limits are set to humanitarian activity by authorities who may be deliberately trying to limit humanitarian action and the delivery of humanity in armed conflict, but also blocking and restrictions can be more organic and less deliberate. They can be problems of feasibility. It is just incredibly difficult to reach people. It can be a problem of resources. There are not the resources in money or time to reach people in time, to show humanity in action. So those kind of restricting problems in humanity can be deliberate, but they can be structural and entrenched logistical or resourcing problems, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. The third area where we face operational challenges and probably more dilemmas around delivering the principle of humanity into action in armed conflict is when we have to balance it with our other principles. And you're going to have seminars for the next few weeks on the other principles. It's difficult to talk of one in isolation from the other. But as you know, very often when you are actively designing and trying to implement humanitarian programs, you are inevitably balancing the core four principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. You're having to make certain choices up and down a scale of how impartial you can be from 1 to 10, how neutral you can be from 1 to 10, how independent. And very often humanity is considered as part of that balancing act. How much are we going to prioritize humanity over impartiality, neutrality, and independence? Is it more important to reach people and save their lives and protect their person as much as we can, even if it means we lose some of our independence and our neutrality, and we are not able to operate impartially over a whole conflict, but only in one area? How do we balance these principles? And I think very often we have to recognize that, as in a game of cards, where sometimes in games of cards you have one suit, whether it's diamonds or clubs or hearts or spades, that becomes a trump, that is a sort of magic card that has priority over other suits. I think we have to recognize, and I think we're right to do this very often, that humanity in many situations acts as a trump principle, that we will accept some compromises on our other principles to deliver humanity in action. So we have the challenge of the trump. But is that trump card, that trump principle, always to be used? And we at ICRC certainly recognize many situations, not many, but several situations in our history and even today when we will not play the trump of humanity, and actually we will withdraw. And we will tend to withdraw and not prioritize humanity over other principles under two conditions. First of all, if we're working with authorities with whom it's clear that they will participate in no concrete steps to help us ensure the principle of humanity and deliver humanitarian action, if there is nothing that they will do with us to help us be humanitarian, that presents us with a real problem. And the second condition is if really we find no common ground of overlapping values, that we really cannot negotiate with them, design a program that is satisfactory and fair and impartial and neutral and to any degree with them, that we cannot yet find a way to do a humanitarian deal with them. And that is another pressing problem. So there are situations, and thankfully they are rare, when humanity will not trump moral compromise on other principles, but actually we will think there is nothing we can do with these parties. We never stop talking to them, we never stop negotiating, and very often we succeed, like many of you, over time. But there are times when we will stop. The fourth area I want to talk about after those consequences in the last area is the question of ownership and universality. The background paper for this poses the question of who owns humanitarian principles, who owns the principle of humanity. And obviously speaking from the ICRC, I want to make a very clear statement that the principle of humanity is universal. This is fundamental to the fundamental principles, that we all share a conviction in humanity and we all share the ability to be humane and humanitarian. Everyone is and can be a humanity activist. And at the UN General Assembly in a couple of weeks in New York, our president is hosting an event called Uniting Around the Principle of Humanity. And the purpose of this is to bring together political actors, humanitarian actors, religious actors, non-religious actors, to showcase the universality of the conviction to the principle of humanity, that it is universal. And as such, at ICRC, we recognize humanity as a common and shared feeling between human beings, but also, politically, we recognize it as an essential principle in international politics and international relations. We want everyone to embrace humanity. We want states and non-state actors to recognize a global contract of humanity as a fundamental basic agreement between peoples, states, armed groups on humane treatment in armed conflict. And the increase in humanitarian action is a sign of this solidifying global humanity contract. And I think at ICRC, despite the deliberate failures of humanity that you, and particularly you where you are, see around you very often, we feel sure that the movement for humanity is bigger than the movement for inhumanity. And therefore, humanity is a principle for everyone. We need a wide range of humanity activists, and we have them. First responders, neighbors, families, authorities, local authorities, state authorities, faith-based groups, NGOs, CBOs, the military, business, Red Cross and Red Crescent, and UN agencies. And we need this whole range of humanity activists to work in armed conflict these days. And here, of course, we would also want them to work with the second principle of impartiality, which you will be talking about next week. But we want humanity in action to be guided by impartiality. In other words, to be delivered with total non-discrimination and purely with an objectivity of need. So needs-based, non-discriminating humanitarian action, which sees everyone as essentially equal because they share humanity and distinguished only by their need. So to conclude, what I've tried to do in this little session is 4 things: to understand the value of humanity as our goal and purpose in humanitarian action, to look at how that principle of humanity, that value, is elaborated concretely in law and in field practices of assistance, protection, and advocacy or diplomacy. And third, I've looked at some of the operational problems around trying to deliver on humanity. And finally, I've emphasized the universality of humanity and the importance of being humanitarian and being impartial as a humanitarian, which you'll look at next week. Thank you.
Always very informative presentation by you on the principle of humanity. Also glad that we managed to get you to be able to speak about your favorite principle. I didn't realize that the ICRC allowed people to play favorites with the principles, but I think you've done a very good job of explaining not only the importance of humanity here, but of its fundamental nature, and in particular your discussion of the way in which it trumps the others. Before we move on now to the next part of this event, the panel discussion, I just need to take care of a little bit of business, and that is that there is an assessment code on your screen right now, 4657, and this briefing was part of PHAP's online learning sessions on humanitarian law and policy, and PHAP members are able to take a 2-part assessment of their continuous learning credits. So once the assessments are live, you'll be notified by via email. And please note down this code, that's 4657, in order to complete these assessments. You're going to need that code. Next, just to say that if you look at your screen right now, you'll see a link to the recording of today's event. All materials and resources related to today's event are available at that link that you see on your screen. It will be processed within a few hours after this session is done and then posted there. Okay,